Hello, my name is Jared Ludlow, Publications Director at the BYU Religious Studies Center, your weekly resource for gospel scholarship. And today I'm joined by Don Bruger, Senior Editor here at the Religious Studies Center, and we'll be talking about possible resources that can accompany your Come Follow Me reading for April 10th through 16th, Matthew chapters 15 through 17 and Mark chapters 7 through 9. And all of these chapters focus a lot on Peter, and that's what these resources particularly focus on. And so we'll be talking about three articles that talk about Peter's ministry. And all three of them come from the same Sperry Symposium volume that had its focus on Peter as the great apostle. So the first one is called Peter's Keys. It's by Kent Brown, a former religion faculty member here at BYU. And in here, he talks about how Latter-day Saints, when they hear Peter's keys, might think differently than what it could have meant to him and others during the New Testament time period. And so he wanted to explore a little bit more about what it might have meant in the world of the Bible. And so he starts off talking actually from a passage in Isaiah that a man named Eliakim is given the keys to the house. And it seems like his role was as a royal treasurer. And then he also mentions, and in the book of Revelation, it's the resurrected Christ who holds the key of David. And so there's these two different passages of Scripture that talk about keys in Scriptures. So he goes on and he's going to talk about the specific passage in Matthew chapter 16 that talks about Jesus promising to give the keys to Peter. So, Don, anything that stood out to you from this article?
Yes. When Professor Brown talks about the keys and so on, he makes it clear that it's not just keys of authority and so on to bind and seal on earth as in heaven and so on, but he goes beyond and make connections to these keys can actually grant access to keys of knowledge and the keys of heaven. And he tells how Christ had to descend into the world of spirits, kind of take control of the keys over death and hell to open the prison doors for people to no longer be captive there, and how in performing this role, Christ is opening the door for all of us to be resurrected, redeemed, and to ultimately be granted access to heaven through those keys, which you see in the temple being applied. And that's what's really impressive to me, the temple associations with what he's talking about.
Great. Those are great points because, yeah, in the scripture passage, it does talk about Hades or the gates of hell, gates of heaven, and so forth. And so uh, Kent Brown does talk about those kinds of aspects of the Greek and what's going on in the scripture passage. And so I'll just end with his conclusion. He says, effectively, through the power of Jesus' atonement, Jesus provides not only an escape from the prison, but also an entry into his heavenly kingdom, an entry that he places in the hands of Peter and the 12 by transmitting keys to them. Finally, it becomes clear that Jesus guides the whole experience so that his future earthly church becomes the repository of celestial power whose reach extends into the heavenly world. Thus, Peter, along with his fellow members of the 12, become the administrators of the house of God. All right, the second article is called Peter, Stones, and Seers, and it's by Sean Hopkin, who's currently the chair of the Ancient Scripture Department here at BYU. He also focuses on a passage that Ken Brown did from Matthew chapter 16, verses 16 through 19. And he gives a close reading of these well-known verses and particularly looks at the phrase, upon this rock I will build my church. And that he equates Peter himself with the rock upon which the church would be built. And again, he wants to understand how the early disciples would have understood this statement, connecting Peter with these keys and so forth. And Sean Hopkin looks a little bit more at the high priest role, and particularly a Joseph Smith translation of John 1:42 that says that when Jesus calls him Peter, a rock, or also a seer. And so he connects the high priest's use of the Urim and Thummim with some of what is going on here with Peter. So, any insights you gained from this article?
Yes, what comes to mind is how good, how talented Sean Hopkins is at pulling out so many associations, connections, intersections throughout the whole corpus of Scripture to bring to bear on what he's talking about here. And it's really impressive how he shows aspects of intertextuality and how the scriptures can be read in such a deep fashion where there are layers of meaning and so on. And he has this, again, this talent for pulling it together and presenting it that way. And it's quite a amazing display of scholarly skill to that affords us so many insights that we could ponder as we read through what the meaning is, what the greater import of the passage is, where Christ entrusts the keys to Peter.
Yeah, and I like, building on that, how he also connects it then to Joseph Smith and the Restoration, because some of these same aspects show up there as Joseph Smith as a seer and a prophet and receiving keys and so forth come later on. And so, again, I'll just jump to his conclusion where he talks about how Jesus' own disciples would likely have connected his designation of Peter as the rock on whom the church would be built with Davidic messianic expectations centered on the temple. Jesus was appointing Peter as the leader or high priest of his new community, one with temple authority over the gates of death, one with authority to use the Urim and Thummim to gain revelation for God's community, and possibly one with authority to help that community receive their own revelation and symbolically enter into the presence of God. The third article is called Whom Say Ye That I Am? Peter's Witness of Christ, and it is by Terry Ball, a former Dean of Religious Education here at BYU. Terry starts off talking about how Peter is often beloved by believers because he seems the most authentic and approachable to us, because we see some of his weaknesses as well as his strengths. So we can understand him, we can empathize with him. And perhaps the gospel writers intended this so that we can make this personal connection with Peter. And so they purposely preserve more of his experiences and conversations with Jesus than with any of the other original 12. And so they speak so often and intimately of Peter's association with Christ because they hope that as we come to love and understand Peter, we ourselves will be more ready and able to accept his special witness of Christ, a testimony that he seems to have been carefully prepared to bear. And so that's, what Terry Ball is focusing on is Peter's witness or testimony of Jesus Christ. So what's something that you'd like to share about this article?
I kind of saw it the same way, where you focus on Peter's witness of Christ, but the whole point is to kind of help us learn of Christ and be tutored of Christ in the same way Peter was, by seeing these experiences through Peter's eyes. Professor Ball points out that Peter was one of the most reprimanded or rebuked disciples in the gospel record. I'm sure it was a gentle rebuking going on there and so on, but Peter grew tremendously as a result. What impressed me is how Christ tutored Peter, though. It was not always with direct statements and explicit instructions and so on, but there'd be short, crisp statements and so on, things that would force Peter to really come to terms and wrestle with it. And then, as Professor Ball says, through his head, his heart, and his hands, he would come to a greater understanding eventually, which then we could look at ourselves and say, who do I say Christ is? What does he expect of me? How can I be better and progress as Peter did, to the point of being entrusted with something great in the Lord's kingdom?
Well, that's a great insight because, I think that's a strength of this article is not just talking about Peter's experience, but then how does that relate to us? And so I like how he frequently, brings it to us and our spiritual development and growth, how we could be like Peter, and hopefully we can strengthen our testimony and witness of Christ to be able to say some of the same statements that Peter said about him, and then also, like you said, to know what is expected of us and as a disciple of Christ and to follow him.
Right. And one thing, just playing off of that, though, is that when Christ was teaching Peter in these amazing ways, he was always the master teacher, of course, and so on. Let Peter learn these things like through his own experience and stuff. Um, what interests me is that it makes us think that what is Christ trying to teach me now that perhaps I'm not fully grasping right now? So this gave me a good kind of wake up call to be more considerate of the ways the Spirit works in my life, where Christ might be nudging me towards something, but unless I'm paying attention, I'm not going to grasp the concept. And watching what Peter went through and his growth that came as a result of learning more what Christ expected of him and so on, and the blessings he had in store for him, excites me to keep trying to be in tune and keep going through the process as Peter did and have hope in the final outcome.
That's great. Yeah, so we hope these 3 articles will help all the readers understand more about Peter, the chief apostle, and then how we can follow his example as a disciple of Jesus Christ.